Are we online, Cam? Right. Well, welcome to the final speech, presentation of Gibson Talk Series 2. Our speaker is Associate Professor Richard Egan. Welcome to you, Richard. On behalf of the Gibson Talks Committee, Richard is the co-director in the Social and Behavioural Research Unit, Te Hunga Rangahau Whanau Papori, Department of Preventive and Social Medicine, Te Tara Haora, Tutanui, Dunedin School of Medicine, Te Kuri Harora Otipoti. I think I know what most of that means now. His major project at the moment is appropriate for us, spiritual care and the healthcare research project. As well, he has been part of a Marsden grant funding study of 6 academics examining exceptional cancer trajectories research, which is ongoing. The aim appears to be a process in facilitating longer survival for many cancer patients. The exceptional survival today will be the norm of tomorrow. That's the prediction. Hope so. 81 participants were interviewed, about half of that number in person, the remainder by phone after the onset of the COVID-19 epidemic. But however, tonight he is going to be talking particularly about spirituality and ageing. I'm pleased to see he spells ageing the same way as I do. He leaves the A in it, otherwise I'm always tempted to say agging, if you'll forgive me. Anyway, Richard, over to you.
Thank you very much. Kia ora koutou, mihi nui koutou ko Richard Egan aho. I'd like to acknowledge the Gibson committee, particularly George and Rod, and actually Prof Colin Gibson taught me. I did an English degree many years ago. I'd also like to acknowledge Prof Peter Matheson, who I came to one of these talks last year before his death, and I'd just like to acknowledge him and the impact he had on me when I was in the seminary, which was quite significant as a church historian. So I've been thinking a lot about this talk, and I finally got to the age where I can say I'm aging. So I've been talking about spirituality and aging for about 20 or 30 years, and people would heckle me and say, "You're not old enough to talk about that." But last week, or the week before last, I turned 60, so I'm now in the aged, older age bracket, which is quite exciting. It's all relative, isn't it? And one of the things I've been thinking about is how much of myself do I talk about in these sort of places. And there's only one other talk. My mum's a Christian meditator through the Catholic Church, and she had me at a conference, and I told a story about my own spiritual history, and I hummed and hawed and thought, well, should I tell it here? And I'm going to. It tells a lot more about myself than I normally do. Academics don't usually talk about themselves. They just talk about their research. But anyway, I've called the story From RC to SBNR, and that means from Roman Catholic to spiritual but not religious. And I have a caveat to this story, and that is I do not reject religion. In fact, it would be absurd given over 80% of the world is still religious, although the opposite is true in New Zealand, and the positive impacts of religious practice are evident. So I'd like to tell the story as a spiritual reflection. Roman Catholic, Irish, Kiwi, New Zealander, tangata tiriti. I grew up Catholic. We moved every 2 years until I was 12. So I went to lots of schools, and many of them Catholic, where I enjoyed religious education, having some inspiring teachers. Sister Marietta, Brother Eddie, and Father John were the 3 main ones. Spiritual formation was inherent in my school years, with short retreats, regular mass and confession, and even a stint with the charismatic renewal within the Catholic Church in my mid-teens, where I experienced speaking in tongues and enjoyed the enthusiastic approach surrounded by other young people. I was also interested in liberation theology at school, being inspired by its emancipatory mandate for the poor and the oppressed. The concept of spiritual literacy is about having the experiences and language to be able to express one's spiritual needs, ask for help, and help oneself in times of spiritual distress, the times of life when one questions what's it all about. I found that my Catholic faith filled this need up until my early 20s. I would suggest that many here have very high spiritual literacy, but I would also suggest that spiritual literacy is not as common as it once was. This is a challenge for many, especially when faced with personal, national, or global crises. As an aside, the phrase existential crisis has been used more and more in our global community. If you listen to national radio, they're always talking about existential this and existential that. And I think that such things as the COVID pandemic, the climate crisis, economic instability and warfare have been part of that existential crisis. Having a personal response, for example, in the form of meditation to such a crisis, I believe is important to stave off anxiety and depression, two of the other pandemics we currently face. The next stage, the seminary. I thought early I wanted to be a priest. Around 12, I wrote down in a school exercise book that I wanted to be a priest. I went to Dunedin's Diocesan Seminary out in Mosgiel. Many of you know where that is. At 19, I packed up my VW combi and travelled down with my mum to Mosgiel. It was a great experience, a time of prayer, reflection, learning and surfing. The first year was all about formation, so we did a lot of self-discovery exercises, prayer, mass every day, morning and evening prayer, and spiritual direction. In the second year, we started a theology degree through Otago Uni. That's where I met Peter, actually. We had visiting priests who taught us sadhana, a Christian guided meditation technique, which I enjoyed but didn't continue. I have since learnt that there are many forms of Christian meditation from such lines as the Jesuits and Benedictines. One might argue that the sages and saints often had their own form of meditation. While in the seminary, I learnt about church history, Christology, theology, and so on. My faith was undermined to some degree by this learning, or my simplistic faith. Many of the things that I held to be true I now understood were human constructs, and the fallibility of the Catholic Church's leaders and future leaders impacted on my young development. My wonderful spiritual director, Sister Bernie Chain, I don't know if anyone knows Bernie Chain, she was a great Dominican nun who I'm still friends with. She suggested during my second year that given my developing relationship with a woman in town, whom I'd met in class as she was at Knox College, I should consider leaving the seminary, and she was right. Those 2 years had been an important stage of my spiritual development. Just a word about creation theology. Via Meister Eckhart and Matthew Fox's Original Blessing, this was a revelation to me in the seminary, understanding that we as humans are born originally blessed as opposed to original sin, rang true for me, though not always true in the mainstream Catholic theology. It was a theology connected to creation and the idea of panentheism, that God is all and more, has stayed with me ever since. My beliefs about God and Jesus have changed radically in those 2 years. Next stage, an itinerant surfer and seeker. I didn't quite know what to do next after you leave the seminary, so I moved to Wellington, partly following the woman, and saved money to travel. A friend was playing rugby in Italy, and he invited me to stay there and go for a surf trip across Europe. This 1 year trip turned into almost 3 years. It was a time of spiritual exploration in a different way. I had all sorts of experiences, read widely, across the so-called New Age literature, explored different belief systems, and shared lots of travellers' books. While surfing around European coast, I visited Taizé in France and lots of churches and temples across Europe and Africa. including the church at the end of the Camino walk where we surfed nearby. At the end of this period, I came home to 6 months in Australia, and there I did my first Vipassana course. Vipassana meditation. I tried all sorts of meditation and contemplation approaches while travelling, but none of them particularly seriously. But then I met an osteopath who told me about the 10-day silent retreat that was held in the Blue Mountains close to Sydney, and I was fascinated. In a specially developed retreat centre in a stunning setting, I embarked on what has become a life-changing experience. I've been doing yoga classes in Sydney, so I thought I was fit and flexible, but I didn't really know what to expect in 10 days. Vipassana meditation claims that it's the technique the Buddha taught. Importantly, it's not a religion, but a technique of breath and sensation observation to ultimately understand one's mind. The meditation is taught within a Buddhist framework, and that it was a foundation in what they called the Eightfold Noble Path. And they talk about these 3 areas: sila, which is about ethical conduct, samadhi, which is about mind training and concentration, and then panya, which is about the wisdom element. You can only learn it the first time in a 10-day silent retreat, though you can do shorter retreats thereafter. The aim of the meditation is the development of awareness, now often called mindfulness, equanimity, that's a balanced mind, love and compassion. The awareness comes through the regular practice of observing one's breath, it's called anapana, and one's sensations, which is the Vipassana technique. Not just observing and not reacting. As you know, one's focus flits around like a fantail, so bringing attention back to the breath or to sensation is half the work. The other half of the work is observing, not reacting, but observing all things happening in the mind as it passes through and on the body as we feel pain and pleasure and everything in between. Behind this Buddhist idea is that suffering is a dominant human experience. And I've recently had it explained to me as a state of unsatisfactory experience, which is an interesting, I think, reflection on our human experience. By developing one's awareness and equanimity, one is less likely to grasp or reject things in experience that they call aversion and craving. Therefore, accepting life happens, not reacting blindly, but acting mindfully, hence the mindfulness. This is a lifelong practice, literally, as mindfulness and equanimity are certainly fleeting from day to day. Vipassana can be done from any belief system, point of view or religion, and they suggest that some Jesuits do a Vipassana retreat before their ordination in India. Being on a long retreat is quite a unique experience where your meditation becomes much deeper and that your awareness becomes more acute, your capacity to observe increases, and your clarity of thought becomes quite profound. In this tradition on retreat, one takes the mantle of a monk or a nun, taking a vow to follow all the strict rules, which include a detailed timetable that starts at 4 a.m. and finishes at 9 p.m. It includes a vegetarian diet. Old students don't have anything after lunch. No reading or writing, a strict silence, and not looking at anyone the whole time. Essentially, you act as though you're there by yourself, but you're there with other people for convenience. Someone else cooks for you and cleans for you, and you just learn the practice of meditation, essentially for 10 hours or more a day. You pay what you can afford at the end, not for your own stay, but for someone else's after you. It's a lovely idea called dana. A little bit like koha, actually. There is a teaching session at night, and you hear about the theory behind it. On the second to last day, you learn a third meditation technique alongside breath meditation and sensation meditation. It's called the meditation of loving kindness. This is a balm to all the deep pain and observation one has been doing over the previous 8 days. I've now done about 14 of these 10-day retreats and a couple of shorter ones. You can do them up north in Kalkopa. To say that I love this experience is not quite right, but it's a very powerful experience. a privilege, and I know this is not something that everyone can do, take 10 days away from work or their family. The first time I did it, I came away feeling high, clean and clear. I was astounded. I now realise it's not always like that, but it's always another step towards a more mindful life where I'm improved internally and hopefully a kinder person. The next stage, a BA Honours, teaching, a Master of Philosophy, a mental health promoter, a Doctor of Philosophy, a lecturer and a researcher. These are my professions and roles and qualifications. They describe years of my life, all after that first meditation retreat when I was 25 years old. I did a degree in English and religious studies, which expanded my views on spirituality. However, I didn't always keep up my meditation, sometimes with many months of falling off the cushion. But again and again, I'm pushed back to meditation as I recognise increasing chaos in my own head and sometimes in my life, relationships and work. Meditation helps me to see clearly, helps me to put things in perspective, and it helps deal with a world that is often dysfunctional, disconnected, and disenchanted. I'm very interested in this idea of disenchantment. It comes from the sociologist Weber and probably thinkers before him, suggesting the world can be known, understood, and explained purely through a scientific lens. Gone is the mystery and the experience of the transcendence, whatever that may be. The disenchanted world is reduced to rationalisation, a black and white world, from my point of view, often lacking colour and wonder. This may not be fair to Weber and the hard scientists who I often work with, but I hope you get the idea. In healthcare, I call this biomedicalisation, where one focuses only on the biological aspects of a person, their limbs and their diseases, as opposed to a whole person. My interpretation is that disenchantment is part of our spiritual deprivation in postmodern society, in the world that we live in now, where we often lack attention to see connection with self, others, the arts, nature, and something larger than ourselves, the transcendent, however that may be understood. The common call for well-being, which I'll talk a bit about later, I think is about this reconnection, which brings us back to meditation for me, or other spiritual practices, that brings us to awareness of what is present, not longing for or worrying about the past or anguish about the future. Those moments of awareness bring wisdom and meaning, even in suffering, I would suggest. Viktor Frankl, who many of you will have read, his words ring true here, I think, where he says, man or woman is not destroyed by suffering, he's destroyed by suffering without meaning. And meaninglessness comes from being mindless and disconnected and brings dysfunction, arguably, which I sometimes experience personally and see in others in the world at large. Which brings me to a recent experience of my own suffering, long COVID. Like most of us, I got COVID a couple of times. The second time it really knocked me over, and I didn't rest long enough, and I ended up suffering with long COVID for nine months. In hindsight, it was a great teacher, and I learnt a lot. But in the midst of it, I was shattered, and for a while desperate for healing and to get back what it had always been, really good health. I was sleeping 2 or 3 times a day, I had a constant headache that drugs didn't impact on, and I had a lethargy, a COVID brain experience that left me listless. I tried everything from Chinese medicine, veganism, natural medicines, fasting, and so on. What helped me get through were 2 things. Well, there was more than that, but thinking of my wife as well. I was forced again back into meditation. I would do it after almost every sleep, lying down and meditating. Eventually, I decided to change my attitude towards COVID, which came from learning from those who I'd interviewed in my research. I've interviewed hundreds of people about cancer. So I tried to learn to love it, love my experience, and appreciate what I was going through. It was a whole different way of looking at it. It's hard to know why I came out of long COVID, and the science around it is pretty slim, actually. It's pretty hard to work out the etymology, etc., not etymology, the pathways around long COVID. But I ended up taking 6 weeks off, at the end of the year because I tried to work through it, and that helped for sure. But the meditation, I think, was key to surviving it. It was an experience of frailty, like many of us in the fourth age, which happens at different times, but it's when your body is slowly changing and becoming more and more frail. Like a cancer experience, it changed the way I saw things. Another existential and spiritual challenge. A small dark night of the soul, desert experience, or what Fox calls via negativa, a teacher. Finally, still learning. I'm increasingly believe in the importance of spiritual practice, whatever that practice might be. This is critical at the end of life, where my PhD thesis highlighted the pursuit of peace in the dying process. But we need a way to find peace, internally and with those around us. A spiritual practice during life ideally sets us up for living well and dying well. I've lived a blessed life, privileged in many ways, and I'm very aware that I need to use my privilege. For me, it's about teaching, learning, and helping to create an environment where spirituality can flourish, largely in healthcare, but with some luck further afield. Meditation has helped my inner weather patterns to both be more understood, observed and not always reacted to, but also in the observation, meditation has helped create a more settled times and less storms. Thank you for listening to the story. It's a story through a spiritual lens. And interestingly, we're now teaching medical students in year 2, 3 and 4 about spirituality and how to think about taking a spiritual history. And I say think about taking a spiritual history because I haven't got any evidence that they're doing it yet. But we're showing them the evidence around spirituality in healthcare, talking about their own spiritual well-being, and then saying this is an important component in the well-being and the healing of the people that you're working with. But watch the space. Okay, I'll go to the PowerPoint. Oh, actually, what might stop there? Any questions or comments? Yeah. Do we just? I'll repeat the question. Oh, we've got a mic. Yeah.
I wonder if you could just elaborate, please, on how you encourage the young medical students to ask people about their spiritual history. I've been a health professional and always found it hard to ask people in a way that they felt comfortable with. And secondly, I've just had 2 groups of medical students, 6 of them come and interview me as an older person, and it didn't come up.
Interesting. So it's not working. Thank you.
They were stumbling around with questions, and I think it might have been rumbling within them.
What year were they?
Second or third.
Second
I'm just
or third,
not sure.
yeah.
Just not sure.
Yeah, so I'll tell you what, I only have 1 hour in second year, so it's like a lecture to 250 people. 1 hour in third year, again a lecture. But in fourth year, which unfortunately only happens to the Dunedin cohort, doesn't happen in Wellington and Christchurch, I have two hours and a bit, and that's in a small group of 20. Now that's a fabulous occasion where I give them a reminder of what I've been talking about in second and third year. I say, what do you remember? And it's usually nothing. But I give them a bit of what I'm going to show you next. And I guess what I encourage them to do is develop their own spiritual care toolbox. So they have to develop something that they feel comfortable with. And I give them a whole lot of possible questions. Some are evidence-based, based on what's in the literature. And some, for example, I've got a slide, 10 ways to ask about spirituality without using the S word. And so that might be, what matters most to you? Or, let's think about how can we that palliative care question, how are you? Rather than asking how is your limb or your disease, it kind of gets to the core. So we go through a whole lot of different questions, but you have to start with the evidence. They're all scientists, they're hard scientists. So I always start with the evidence and then go to these are questions you can ask. But thank you. Yeah. Was there one more question? Oh yeah, cool. Yeah. Oh, it was the same. Yeah, okay. Well, I'm not going to get through all of this because for some reason I'm not great on timing. But I've talked about that. So what I'd like to do now is talk about, can you see that, the spiritual care framework? Yeah, so this is actually how I express spirituality or talk about spirituality a lot of times. And if you've ever seen me talk about it, you will have seen it. It has changed. It keeps evolving based on evidence and, in fact, some of my own insights or perceptions. And it's got 5 elements. And the idea is, one of the first questions people ask me when I say I'm interested in spirituality and healthcare, they say, well, what are you talking about? What does it mean? I said, well, it means something different to everybody, but there are these components that you can talk about to understand it. And these 5 elements, so definitions, plural, the principles or models, evidence, the zeitgeist, and the numinous, and that's a new component that I added last year or so. So if we first look at scope or definitions, you won't be able to see this, but the bottom line behind this slide is that there's been a review of all the published definitions up to 2021. In the 166 articles, they did basically a content analysis, and they found that the most common item in the spirituality definitions was connection, which is very interesting. And a lot of people talk about connection when I ask them what it might be. Meaning and purpose was the second one. Then came God, and then the transcendent, etc. So kind of in this context, this definition is the most common or the most ubiquitous definition in the literature. It comes from Christina Puchalski and et al. It talks about spirituality being dynamic and intrinsic, which is an argument suggesting that we all have a spiritual domain or a spiritual lens we look through. And then it talks about meaning, purpose, transcendence, and the things that can be expressed through, like family, community, society, nature, etc. It is a epidemiological nightmare because it's very difficult to measure that very broad definition. This definition comes from Elizabeth McKinley, and if you're interested in spirituality and aging, she's one of the best. She's a professor from Australia, semi-retired now, and she's developed a huge amount of data, books and articles, and I think this is a nice simple one in terms of definitions. In New Zealand, of course, we talk about wairua, which is the Māori expression, or not exactly the same as spirituality. In fact, part of our 3-year study that I might get time to talk about has been looking at spirituality and how people understand and express that. And one of the things that we found is that the idea of wairua and wairuatanga, or wairua tohanga, or many versions of wairua, is that it is a different expression and a different understanding to non-Māori Pākehā understandings, and that's quite an important understanding, particularly for Māori. But I think this is a couple of interesting expressions here. There's an organisation I do a bit of work with called Meaningful Age in Australia, and they developed all sorts of good resources around spirituality. And they express spirituality through those connections that I talked about before, connections to self, others, nature, creativity, and something bigger than yourself. And they've actually developed an assessment tool for age residential care. And it's kind of one of my favourite assessment tools. There's dozens of these assessment tools, but this is when you go into age residential care and they do that history and what do you want, etc., etc. The way that they ask about spirituality and religion is often done poorly. But this particular tool says, well, what are you connected to? What would you like to be connected to? And how can we facilitate that better? Which I quite like. And I think that's another way of thinking about spirituality in its broadest sense. So those are the definition articles or issues. The second one is around principles. And I think that the way that we think about health, haora, well-being, impacts on how we practice. That's basically what I say to healthcare professionals. If you think that health is about your physical health, is about you as a machine or a clock or something, and you need to fix that clock, then that's how you're going to basically interact with a person. But the beauty of our medical students now is that they've all come, not all of them who've come through the New Zealand education system know about Te Whare Tapa Whā. Since 2000, the health and physical education curriculum has included haora and Te Whare Tapa Whā. So every one of these people who come from the New Zealand education system, I don't have to teach them about Wairua and spirituality. They go, oh yeah, Tapa Whā. They don't quite know what it is and how to operationalise it, but it's not a foreign idea. Now this was radical. Kia ora to Sir Professor Mason Jury. Unfortunately, the current rewriting of the curriculum doesn't have haora in it, and I'll be writing a submission about that because I think it's been one of our... I mean, when I tell people overseas, they can't believe that we've got that in our state education. So those are the models there. You know, Te Whare Tapa Whā, Whānau Whālei is the Pacific Samoan model, and the hospice model mirrors Tapa Whā, and there's that Connect to, that Meaningful Age in Australia one. The third component of this is around evidence. And I won't go through all of these, but if you're looking for a good article about the evidence around spirituality and health, you can't go much further than this. It comes from the Journal of American Medical Association. It's one of the top 5 journals in medicine. It's a review article which took all the evidence to date, and basically they said spirituality impacts positively on health outcomes. It's not very well addressed, and this is across the world, and that we need to address it for quality of life and other health outcomes. So it's associated, for example, with better end-of-life outcomes. And there's all sorts of research. There's now over 70,000 peer-reviewed publications on spirituality, religion, and healthcare. We've done a whole lot of, and you can see this, you'll get the slides. We've done a whole lot of projects. From 2010, when I finished my PhD, we've done about 16 different projects on spirituality and healthcare. And as I said, we're doing this big HRC 3-year project. We've also got a project looking at 18 to 25-year-old males, spirituality and mental health. There's all sorts of issues around young men in New Zealand, suicide and mental health. And I've got a new psych reg, actually, from Ashburn Hall, who's looking at young women between the ages of 18 and 25 and their spiritual needs and mental health. I'd just like to acknowledge that this isn't just me and a few people around the world talking about this. This is New Zealand's Health Quality and Safety Commission, a major government organisation, and they have a Te Ao Māori framework that has Wairuatanga at the centre of it. And this diagram is a diagram that Tess Moaki Maxwell, Dr. Tess Moaki Maxwell, and a couple of others of us developed as a New Zealand palliative care model. And one of the interesting things about this model, while it includes Wairua and the other 4 domains, it also has this idea of the seen and the unseen, which I included. It kind of connected to, is it in the Creed, the seen and the unseen? It came from my Catholic background somewhere, and I thought recognising this idea of the seen and the unseen, is it the Creed? Yeah. Of all that is seen, yeah, exactly. In terms of spirituality and longevity, this was a really nice article that I found for this talk, actually. It comes from 2024, and it talks about these key things about spirituality and longevity. It promotes longer life, enhances psychological resilience, encouraging healthy lifestyles. Actually, the research on religious spirituality and healthy lifestyles is very, very strong, such that he's the superstar of spirituality and healthcare, a guy called Harold Koenig, who's a psychiatrist, a public health doctor, and an incredible researcher, and Christian, actually. He says that, and he's shown through evidence that you're better to be religious, like the outcomes from being religious are better than giving up smoking, which is an interesting contrast. He's very interested in encouraging people to be religious, unlike me, I'm not too big on proselytizing. Meaning and purpose, and as I've said already, underused in clinical care. The fourth component is the zeitgeist, and that means the spirit of the times. Why are we talking about spirituality now? Many of you will know the census data. For the first time, we had census data where Christianity went down to, no religion went from 34% in 2006 to over half the population who answered the census, to 51% or 52% if you round up in 2023. Very raw data. It doesn't really tell us that much. I mean, I would argue that everyone has a spirituality, but I think the more interesting component, and this comes from the Centre of Religious Diversity data, where they showed that the growing number of people, often migrants, new migrants, we've got growing number of people from other religions, other than Christianity. And I think this is particularly important for ageing because this multicultural and multi-faith nature of our population will be impacting on our healthcare professionals, and that they have to have some insight into the many faiths and the many cultures. So we talk about cultural competency and cultural safety, and I'm arguing that to be culturally safe, you actually have to have an understanding of the spirit of spirituality, and spiritualities plural. The other components, and I'll just quickly go through these, is this idea of the contribution of Māori. We can't talk about spirituality in Wairua without talking about that. The changing, we've talked about spirituality but not religious. The long dying. We know that 60% of us will die of cancer or heart disease, but we don't die of those in days or weeks. Some people do, but more often than not, it's months and years that we have these experiences. And it's a long time to think about the big picture, big questions in life, which are arguably existential and spiritual. And if 80%, based on our recent study, 80% of New Zealanders don't go to church, synagogue or temple. So where do those people go for their spiritual needs when they're in crisis? Part of the answer to that is their healthcare professionals. And I say to doctors that they're the new priests, and they all go, oh my gosh, freaking out about that. But I think that there's a need for new and different pathways for spiritual care. I think that's something that will happen over time. The other question, and this is sort of a theoretical question, is do we have a spiritual vacuum in a post-Christian world? And this is the sort of, Lloyd Gearing's been asking sort of questions like this for years and years. But others have too, Richard Eckersley, Frankel, etc., suggesting that many of our problems in contemporary society may be to do with spirituality. Is there a spiritual gap or a spiritual vacuum? John Bluck asked that many years ago, and what's filling that gap? The other component to think about is the impact of the Pacific nations on New Zealand's spirituality and well-being. And I think this is becoming more profound. We have more Pacific Islanders in Auckland than in many of the islands. And this is increasingly impacting on, I think, particularly in our healthcare. We did a study where we interviewed people on dialysis, and they're all Pacific people. And what we found is that some of them asked their healthcare professionals to pray with them. Now, how do you think healthcare professionals who haven't ever thought about this would deal with that? So that's one of the reasons to actually get these healthcare professionals, doctors and nurses, to say, how would you react to that? What would you do? How would you do it, etc. I love this. This is from Sir Paul Callaghan, who was an atheist, but he said, that's not to say I'm not a spiritual man. And this was when he was dying of cancer. So I would suggest that was something that brought up his own thinking. And he talked about the sense of mystery and that science doesn't have all the answers. And then more recently, I just discovered this from another Sir Professor Richard Fall. Apparently there's something in the listener about him at the moment. And he's a neuroscientist, and a leading neuroscientist internationally. And he said that spirituality is the most important side. Our spiritual side is who we are. It is so vital to our very existence and must never ever be forgotten when you are looking after people. Now, when I read that, I wrote to him straight away. I said, "Hi, I'm Richard. I'm doing all this work on spirituality, and you said this," and I got very excited. And he said, "Well, let's meet for coffee, and so hopefully we're going to catch up sometime." The final component, that looks a bit funny, this is about the numinous. Oh, on the right one. Now, the numinous is an element that I added to this. I used to talk about spirituality from those 4 components, and in some ways I was like trying to argue within a biomedical or scientifically dominated area that spirituality was important as well as all these other things. But what I left out was the unexplained experiences, but the experiences that many of us have. The experiences of getting to the top of a mountain, or I was at Aramoana surfing this morning, it was a spiritual experience, or in the garden, or with music, or in prayer or meditation, or in religious service, or all those experiences that, if you like, are transcendence experiences. Some would say getting closer to God, some would say a mystical experience, etc., etc. But I've come to believe that we can't talk about spirituality without mentioning what I'm calling the numinous, which has got a nice definition actually. It says it's from the Latin meaning arousing spiritual or religious emotion, mysterious or awe-inspiring. Now we're just about there, aren't we, in terms of time? Not too much more. I'd like to recognise the chaplains. I'd like to recognise chaplains, incredibly important people, undervalued. We have 92 chaplains in our hospitals, and they get 0.0001% of the health dollar. There's $32 billion spent on health in New Zealand, and we worked it out. I think it's something like $1.4 million is spent on spiritual care, explicitly. It's one of the reasons I think we got this HRC research is because we argued from a policy point of view that we claimed holistic healthcare in New Zealand, but we weren't putting any money or effort into spiritual care. It'd be interesting to see if we got it under this government. I've often thought about that. But we're right in the middle of data collection. In fact, I just called Tony Lenton yesterday. I don't know if anyone knows Tony Lenton. He's the head of Catholic chaplains in New Zealand. And we're going to survey, I'm hoping, with a very high response rate, all the hospital chaplains in New Zealand, which go through what used to be ICHC, they're now called Healthcare Chaplaincy Aotearoa, and New Zealand Healthcare Chaplaincy Association, and then also there's the Catholic chaplains. They've got 30 chaplains in hospitals, which I think include priests. Like, is Father Mark Chamberlain, I think he's one of them, yeah. Anyway, kia ora to our chaplains. So I might stop there and see how we go with the discussion. I've got some other things, but there's a lot there about that framework of understanding spirituality, from the definitions to the zeitgeist, the evidence, etc. So if there's any questions or comments, I'd love to hear them.
And we're out there. So you have to be here, facing the television, to be also out there. So have any of you got questions you'd like to ask? Or statements you'd like to make?
Oh, kia ora koutou. Thank you, Richard. I just wanted to comment, I'm really glad you mentioned the luminosity, the lumen, because if you ask someone, have you had any transcendent, have you had any awe-inspiring, they might not be able to put things into words, but asking that is so important. And even those without religious, formal, structured beliefs can have sensations, experiences. So I'm really glad that you included it. I think it's so important.
Thank you. Actually, some of you probably heard this because it came out of my PhD, but we found that 48% of people in hospices had experiences that were unexplained. And this was in a survey, and we gave them 5 options: hearing something unexplained, seeing, feeling, one more, and then had not had that experience. But almost half of the people we surveyed, and that was across the 30 hospices, had these experiences. That was staff, family members and patients. I wrote a paper called "The Paranormal is Normal in New Zealand Hospices," and it didn't get accepted in a medical journal, interesting, which it might now, actually.
If you come out.
I just wonder why you said spirituality for older people. What about everyone? No, isn't that good for health and well-being of everyone?
Across the whole lifespan.
Yeah.
I completely agree. Yeah, thank you for that. I guess in academia we cut things up and we put them into little boxes. I mean, this is a focus on older people that partly because there's a number of areas or disciplines within medicine and health and well-being. For example, gerontology, older people's care, and in fact that's what we teach the fourth year medical students is through older people's care. But I agree, it's important across the lifespan. The other thing that it's interesting to think about spirituality in ageing is that I think the ageing process is a spiritual process, and some of us don't necessarily think about those big things when we're younger. One of the reasons we have been interviewing young men between the ages of 18 and 25 about spirituality with mental illness or mental distress is because it's likely that they've thought about things. When you get a mental distress, when you have a mental illness, serious mental distress, it really challenges you and you think about things. But I think if I went down to, that I've had this conversation with my colleague, to a cricket club and young men who had no problems in their life and things were just going along, and I asked them about spirituality, initially they'd go, "What are you talking about?" But if you've had an experience of cancer or mental illness young, you've often thought about some of those things. So I think, it's a difficult one. Actually, incidentally, the findings from that study, we've started to analyse it. We interviewed 20 young men, 9 Māori, remarkably. We were amazed how articulate these young people were about spirituality. Really, really articulate. And also how hopeful they were. Because, you hear a lot of, dysfunction and, lack of hope from young people. These people, it's a qual study and it's not generalisable, but it was fascinating. Any other comments or questions I'd love to have? Yeah.
Thank you, Richard. I guess I'm referring to the first part of your talk, and you talk spirituality and you were brought up Catholic. Is there any connection between spirituality and God? As somebody who comes to a church where we talk God and Jesus and prayer,
where's God?
Lots of people don't experience that.
Yeah.
So what is spirituality and that sort of quest for following Jesus? I'm not quite sure that I'm saying this correctly, but this is a church where we pray and so on to a greater being, but does spirituality demand the idea of a greater being? I guess it's
a good question. It's a good question, and it's a huge debate in the literature. So you've actually articulated something that has been talked about a lot. The way that I would put that is probably tell you a story about that. That definition that was used a lot. It had the transcendent and sacred in it, and that definition was argued over for 3 days in Switzerland. And one of the biggest arguments was about the transcendent and the sacred. Because there's another position that there's a continuum around spirituality between atheist spirituality or secular spirituality and religious spirituality. And the atheist or secular spirituality is about the search for meaning, for purpose, their framework to understand beliefs, their worldview. I would add the transcendent even in the secular or atheist spirituality, because there's often something outside of yourself, not necessarily the trio God that we know theologically, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, and omnipotent, but something outside people. But my mum, still very active Catholic, I would say she's got a religious spirituality. My hardcore scientist mate, he doesn't like the word spirituality, but I'd say that he's got an atheist spirituality. So it's an ongoing debate. You ask a good question.
It's not a debate, but
Oh.
Yeah, well, not for me.
Oh, yeah.
I don't have the answers at all. I'm just looking for them, I guess.
I love that. I don't know if everyone heard that. He hasn't got all the answers. Elizabeth McKinley, who I mentioned before, that wonderful Australian, she says in the field of spirituality, there's more questions than answers, and that's the way it should be, which I think is a great line.
Yeah. Well, can I just say one more thing?
Yeah.
When you went on these 10-day retreats and you benefited hugely, did you feel close to God?
The presence of God. Wow, that's a good question. Yes.
I won't ask further.
We'll have a conversation another time.
Kia ora, Richard. Thanks for speaking to us. I'm Heather. Sorry. I go to this church infrequently.
Yeah.
I'm a fresh psych reg into my third week as we speak.
Great.
Might see, you never know.
Yeah.
And you asked for comments. I found it really useful that you gave us your spiritual history.
Oh, good.
Just kind of
Thank
interpreting the rest of what you had to say. So, I have two questions. The first one, can you give us the reference for you said there was a review article that was talking about physical benefits to spirituality.
If you email me, I can send you all sorts of things if you want, including that, yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Because I think in terms of will this government make any changes that incorporate spirituality, money speaks, and physical health is what costs us money. And so if we can show that people if we cater for them spiritually, then that's going to reduce our hospital costs.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing.
Yeah, we do think about that too, yeah.
And my other question is regarding dementia. And this particularly comes because my own mother, very spiritual, has been very spiritual. She's where my faith comes from. She now has profound dementia. Today, tried phoning her, and as has happened in the past, the phone call came to an end because I think she forgot we were talking on the phone. We lasted 5 minutes. And it's really interesting. I don't know if she has a relationship with God anymore, because I think we have to have a theory of mind to think about what's going on in others' minds to even have a concept of God, and I don't think Mum has that. And I have my own thoughts, but really interested to hear your thoughts on dementia.
We've published 2 papers on spirituality and dementia. I worked with a woman called Chris Perkins, and she was a psychogerontologist. Is that when you're a psychiatrist and a gerontologist? Yeah. And she worked for the Selwyn Foundation at the time, and she did all the interviews of family members and people with dementia who could have some conversation. And I guess her argument is that spirituality, spiritual well-being and spiritual care isn't just about cognition and oral communication, that it's about what Christina Pucholsky would call compassionate presence. And compassionate presence and what's the other word she used? I think compassionate presence is the main one. But that it's not, spirituality is not necessarily about cognition, because I agree with you about thinking about God and that relationship you have. It's often a cognitive experience, but I think there's other ways of doing it. And if you think of the mystics and this meditation thing, actually, it's kind of getting beyond cognition as well. So there's a strong argument for that presence of being with, as opposed to doing to a patient or someone, a family member. That is spiritual care itself. That's what Chris argues. But I'm happy to share those papers too. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think maybe I cannot identify with or recognise Mum's spirituality, but because she's very much regressed, kind of much like a baby, a very small child, but do they not have a spirituality?
I think they do.
Yeah, exactly. So, thank you.
Wonder if I can just broaden this a wee bit. I was 67 or so when I was introduced to the term numinous, which was broadly defined by the other writer of a book I was co-writing with as the sacred. And we were talking about Anzac Day. Why were so many people, when I was 67, that would be back in around about 2010, why were so many more people going to Anzac Day, particularly in Australia where he lived? And his thesis on this was that essentially Anzac Day is a sacred day. It's not a sports day that was introduced in about 1927-28 in Australia, and it caught on in New Zealand. The afternoon became a sort of sports afternoon. But the morning in particular, when people went to services for dawn service in particular maybe, for Anzac Day, John Moses said he could recognise the numinous or the sacred in the way the observance was taking place. And he never, ever wanted it to change from that. He made that quite clear before he died, that that's the way it should have been, although he could see that some RSL leaders would have cast it aside if they could have.
Interesting, thank you.
So that's just another issue of...
I think there was another comment here.
I'd just like to say, I know someone who's been fairly close to us, who's had a hard life, out of her control really, and throughout her life she'd say, praise be to God. She's now in a dementia unit, and I fully believe that she's at peace.
Thank you. Good story. Anyone else?
Stay where you are, John. Just turn around.
My son in Auckland is a pathologist, and he says he will not accept anything that is not evidence-based. How can I approach the word evidence with him? A scientist who's been in the cathedral choir and come through the church ranks, but is now not really aware of the spiritual, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. Good question. I guess I would argue that, what evidence-based medicine came out of drug trials. So the drug trials were things you could do randomised control trials on, etc. But there's all sorts of different types of evidence. And like I said, there's over 70,000 peer-reviewed publications. And epidemiologically, we often are very shy about saying there's a direct correlation between A and B because we need to keep showing the evidence. But the strength of evidence about spiritual care impacting positively on people's lives and on their physical, mental and social well-being is getting stronger and stronger. So things like that JAMA article, so doctors love those sort of articles. There's another article that I just saw in the Lancet. So that's if you think about the BMJ, the Lancet, the Journal of American Medical Association, those are the big medical journals that people take notice of who are doctors and evidence-based approaches. So I guess there's lots of people who don't know that evidence exists. It's quite difficult to show the pathway, how spiritual care works. An example of this is they did a Cochrane review, which is another review process, on how prayer works. They called it distant intercession. And this Cochrane review argued that you couldn't show that prayer worked. But I looked at it and I was very challenged by it because it was very much biomedically focused. So prayer could impact on someone's psycho-social or spiritual domain, but it's quite difficult to measure that. You can, and we're doing it more and more. There's hundreds of instruments now that we do use for survey instruments around spirituality. So watch the space. You might be able to argue with a good article here and there. And thank you too. You taught me as well.
This is kind of in response to what the two of you have said, and this is kind of my thoughts, but really interested to hear what you have to say to them. My faith has changed a lot over the last 43 years, I guess, since I can remember thinking about it. And so I've changed from, growing up strongly Christian, and I definitely wanted other people to be Christian, to be saved, so that they could share eternal life with me. And my faith is very different. In fact, when I joined the Methodist Church, because I own the house next door, I came to the Explorers group and introduced myself and said, "Hi, I'm Heather. I'm kind of not really a Christian because I don't believe a lot of things that I thought you had to believe to be a Christian." And rather than people saying, "Well, what are you doing here?" A lot of people nodded understandingly. So I'm still here infrequently. And I think, because I do sometimes worry about, I wonder about what my mum felt about various siblings of mine who have no active faith. And I wonder is it panentheism? You're saying that God is all, that maybe it matters a whole lot more to us when other people acknowledge that they have faith, because it's a real way for us to connect with them. But maybe that is not actually important to God, because actually God is all, and dare I say it, I think everyone has a spirituality, whether or not they cognitively acknowledge it. I think God is a whole lot bigger than this. And part of me goes, am I just trying to make life easy for myself because now I don't need to stress about all the people who are going to hell and I can just get on and live my life, and it's a whole lot easier to believe that? Or actually can we just trust that actually everyone has spirituality, whether or not they realise it, and let's just encourage what we can of spirituality in all people and celebrate that. What do you have to say to that?
Thank you. I think that was a great comment. I haven't got much more to add to that. I'm aware that it's 8 o'clock. If I just show I'm not going to talk about that because I ran out of time. I really like this slide. It comes from Professor Bruce Rumbold, and he says the recent revival of interest in spirituality in later life marks a significant step forward in the person-centred care of ageing people. The benefits will, however, be of limited value if we do not attend to the settings in which spirituality is to be lived. And I love that from a public health point of view, because it's not just about individual spirituality, spiritual care, spiritual needs. It's about this question, how do we create environments where spirituality can flourish? Now, churches do that and have always done that, but less than 20% of the population goes to church. So what about what I call the forgotten 80% in New Zealand? how can we create environments where their spirituality can flourish? We're pretty lucky in New Zealand because we've got the natural world, all those things, and I think people connect through that. But anyway, thank you, Bruce, for that question. I've got this classic thing I always put about limitations. William James, who wrote about spirituality, and Eckersley talks about the evidence which we draw on. And then finally, I'd like to argue that spirituality is vital for healthy ageing, dying, and quality of care. I think clear, culturally sensitive, holistic models are needed, and I think spiritual care boosts well-being, resilience, and satisfaction, and the evidence is growing. I think most older adults want spiritual care, and these needs are often unmet, and the evidence suggests that. I think integrating spiritual care into policy, practice, and daily interactions is the direction to go, and I'd really like to collaborate on this if anyone is interested. Remarkably, we got that HRC funding, but I had no hope really of getting that. We got a $1.4 million grant for that project that's going on at the moment, where we're mapping spiritual care across the healthcare, but we need to carry on. So, if you'd like to be involved somehow and help fund us for the next thing, we'd love to be involved with you. Thank you very much for your attention, everybody. Kia ora.
We haven't quite got to the very end of it yet, Richard. This is a small token. It's been sitting in my back pocket, so therefore it's ever so slightly bent. It's not warped. Warm. This is just a small gift to say thank you for coming along, thank you for the preparations, and thank you for presenting something which a lot of people would find a great deal of difficulty with. Thank you.
Yeah, good questions. Thank you.